Today we will be looking at bankruptcy filing trends by chapter in the state of Maine. To do this, we have about a dozen charts showing bankruptcy activity in the state going back to 1990. All this data on filings comes from the Administrative Office of the United States Courts. Now, this first chart shows total filings by year in the state since 1990. During that time, there have been about 85,000 cases filed in the state. Back in the early 1990s, there were only around 2,000 cases filed per year. From the late 1990s through 2004, filings were right around 4,500 per year. There was a big spike in 2005, the year of bankruptcy reform, where filings were much higher than any other year. Huge drop off to under 2,000 cases, actually about 1,400 cases in 2006. Filings then rebounded and tripled back up to 4,200 in 2010. This was during the recession. But even there, you can see that filings never made it back to the levels where they had been, say, from 97 to 2004. And then since then, filings have dropped by more than one half, and right now are about the same as what they were back in 1990. Now, looking at filings relative to population, Maine has a very low bankruptcy rate. They're actually the seventh lowest in the country. They've been 39% below average over the years. Most of the Northeast has light bankruptcy rates. These are states colored yellow. The highest bankruptcy rates tend to be states in the Southeast where they have very high Chapter 13 caseloads. Looking at it year by year, you can see that Maine has just consistently been well below the national average every year. So I don't see anything on the horizon that will change that. Now, looking at Chapter 7 cases, and this is, follows the same pattern as total filings. Filings were around 1,500 per year in the early 1990s. It got up to around 4,000 per year from, say, 1997 to 2004. A spike in 2005, a huge drop off, 83% drop the next year, more than tripled through the recession, and then have fallen back down. And right now they're about where they were back in the early 1990s, but more importantly, they're less than one half as what they were in the years prior to bankruptcy reform. Chapter 11 filings in the state, there was a big drop-off through the 1990s, and virtually every state had the same thing. Most years since the late 1990s have been about 15 to 25 cases per year. The exceptions were a little bit higher during the recessions in 2001 and 2008-9. In 2004, these figures were kind of skewed. There were about 25 related cases with the Pegasus satellite communications case that skewed it. Otherwise, the figures would have been consistent with the other years. There were only a dozen cases filed in 2015, and so far 2016 it looks like we're on about the same pace for about a dozen cases. Now, looking at Chapter 13 filings in the state, it seems to be there's kind of 3 and 4 year cycles of higher and lower activity through the years. The biggest years were during the most recent recession, and they've dropped by about one half since then, and are fairly close to historical averages. This drop by half is more than most others. In most other states, the decline has been more in the 1/3 range for Chapter 13 cases. Now, looking at the percent of cases filed as Chapter 13, nationwide, the average has been right around 30% most years. There's some disruption around bankruptcy reform, but other years it's right around 30%, heading up right now. In Maine, started out above 20% in 1990, dropped down to under 10% in the early 2000s, and have been in the 15% range in recent years. So the Chapter 13 rate is relatively low in the state of Maine and throughout most of the Northeast, actually. This next chart shows the unemployment rate by quarter in Maine, and is kind of a proxy of how the economy is going. And one thing you see that from 2006 2008, right at about the national average, Maine went up, but not nearly as much as the national total during the year. So shows that, and actually since 2008, Maine has consistently had an unemployment rate that is below the national average. Right now, below 4%, which is pretty good. National is at about 5%. But Maine never got much above 8%, where the national got up to about 10%. Now, bankruptcy filings peaked nationwide in September 2010 and have been falling steadily since then. The total decline nationwide has been 49% in that time. In Maine, it's been higher than average at about 58%, and that's kind of consistent with most of the Northeast, also the Southwest. The declines have been very big there. Most of the states in the country that file blue are, in the 40 to 60% range, and really most of them are 45 to 55%. And in the Southeast, the declines have been much less in general. Looking quarter by quarter, the percent decline, there's been a lot of fluctuation in Maine, up and down over time, but pretty consistent and generally more than the average. But since Maine doesn't have that many cases filed, a small change can translate to a fairly significant percentage change. Right now, it's a little unclear what the pattern is, except that filings are going down more in Maine than nationwide. Certainly, the rate of decline is slowing down nationwide. So far, in the first 6 months of this year, filings were down in Maine by 14%, which was much more than the national average of around 6%. Other places that are still showing big declines are along the West Coast and a few isolated states. But we're seeing a number of states are actually showing modest increases now. There's about 15 states that are showing increases, and we're expecting more. The third quarter preliminary figures show that Maine may have been down another 20% during that time, so the declines are still continuing in Maine. As far as the outlook goes, it looks like there'll be about 1,600 cases filed in the state in 2016. We're predicting slight increases in coming years, but I still think filings will be well below 3,000 per year in Maine, and I don't see any, it's not likely that filings will return to the 4,500 per year so that we experienced, say, from 1997 to 2004, unless some major legislation change or another very severe recession. Well, that concludes our look at bankruptcy filings in Maine. For more statistical information and other information on bankruptcy, be sure to visit the newsroom section of the ABI website at www.abi.org.